Welcome to the Self-Publishing Experience, the quarterly podcast about indie publishing from the team at Troubador Publishing. Here are your hosts, Stephanie Carr and Jeremy Thompson.
Welcome to the third episode of the Self-Publishing Experience podcast, where we'll be discussing all things children's books.
In this episode, we'll be talking to popular children's book illustrator Dave Hill, chatting to self-published children's book authors Angela Fish and Rob Keeley, looking at the big debate of diversity happening in the sector at the minute, plus speaking to some Troubador staff about things to consider when publishing your children's book.
Over 10,000 children's books are published each year, so if you're thinking of self-publishing your children's story, you're entering a really competitive market. You need to think about ways to make your story stand out from those tried and tested, well-known authors, and also from those, I'm afraid, numerous celebrities who release children's books. If you're writing a children's picture book aimed at the early readers, maybe more than 100 words is probably too many, and it might be an idea to cut some out. Teenage fiction should obviously be longer, maybe 20 to 40,000 words, but of course you can get away with being longer. I mean, for example, look at how long the Harry Potter books are.
I suppose really it's important for authors to consider who they're writing for. So kids today are interested in very different things and they want books that reflect the world that they live in today. They may no longer be interested in traditional fairy tales but would prefer more contemporary themes that are now very popular.
Sales in children's books continue to grow. Children's fiction and novelty books have increased in sales, but the main increase really has come from the non-fiction market. Sales in this area have grown by over 10% for the period ending August 2018, compared to the same period in 2017, so now is the time to publish your children's non-fiction book. Children are inquisitive and they like to ask why. So if you can somehow educate children while keeping them entertained at the same time, you're onto a winner. The Horrible History series has a huge following, for example, and it's just shows how such books can engage with children.
And one category in the children's market which is showing a downward trend, however, is the UK young adult category. This category was actually down by just over 20%. There are so many titles available for sale in this category, and most of them are actually US authors, so it's harder for a UK author of young adult fiction to break through and see real success.
So let's look at how Matador author Rob Keeley set about it when he self-published his children's books. Rob is a writer of short stories and novels for children and has written stories for both older and younger kids. His books have won awards such as the Georgina Hawtrey-Waugh Award and have been longlisted for the inaugural Bath Children's Novel Award and also the International Rubery Book Award. Stephanie caught up with him to discuss his experience of writing and self-publishing.
Okay. You've written books for older children, but also made your picture book debut in 2018 with My Favourite People. Did you find it easier to put this book together, or were there any unexpected challenges you faced that you hadn't encountered before?
It was easier in the sense there was less text to write and edit, but in another sense this made it more difficult as I had a very small number of words in which to tell the story and establish all those characters. I also had to give much more thought to formatting and layout than before, and of course I was working alongside my illustrator, Simon Goodway, to tell the story through pictures as well as words.
Much of your work contains elements of horror, the supernatural and other worldly themes, but with everyday characters and settings that will be recognisable to the children reading them. Do you think it helps for children to see themselves reflected in the characters of the stories they read?
In character terms, while it's important that books should reflect the society we live in, we shouldn't necessarily assume that children can only identify with characters who look exactly like them. We should have characters to reflect different groups in society, but not necessarily define characters by their gender or race or cultural background or disability unless this is relevant to the story. Growing up as a disabled kid in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't a single disabled character in any of the children's books I read. Did this bother me? Not in the slightest. I didn't want to read about my life. I wanted to read about other types of children and go on adventures to places I couldn't physically go.
By placing ordinary characters in extraordinary situations, it almost creates an alternative to the traditional superhero character. Did you know what kind of characters you wanted to create when you started writing, or did they develop as the story progressed?
It's interesting. Yes, I think it's much better to have a regular, everyday kid as your main character because, again, it makes them relatable and the young reader can believe this could really happen to them. If your main character has superpowers and can get out of any difficult situation, there are no obstacles and there's no drama or tension.
As well as the Spirit series, you've also written 3 collections of short stories. Do you prefer being able to develop a story over the course of multiple books, or do you like the challenge of compressing a plot into only a few hundred words?
Certainly with a short story for children, you have to be very focused to maintain their attention and compact plot and character development into 3,000 to 5,000 words. With a series and a story arc, you have the freedom to develop the story and characters over a greater number of words and in a deeper way. But you also have to make sure the individual story has its beginning, middle and end and is satisfying in itself.
Have you found the process of writing a series easy, or is it more difficult than writing a standalone novel? Were there any particular techniques that you found helped in the planning and writing process?
Well, I was keen that each of the Spirits novels should be a self-contained story in its own right and that no prior knowledge was needed, so I always filled in any backstory early on in each book, and I didn't want numbers on the spines because obviously if you see 3 or 4 on its own in a shop, you might be less likely to buy it. What I really did, with the possible exception of the last book, was to treat each one as a standalone novel and then weave the ongoing story around that. So it has to be satisfying in itself as well as on a series level. As to planning, I don't make detailed scene-by-scene plans or character notes. A lot of the writing process is instinctive with me, which is why I used to drive my creative writing tutors mad.
You work quite closely with bloggers to help promote your books, so what would you say are the biggest benefits of the book blogging community, and how has their work impacted upon the self-publishing world?
I've developed a great community of book bloggers and some great friendships. Everyone has been so generous in giving their time, usually for free, to read and review my books. I think it's very valuable because bloggers are readers, and it allows indie authors to go to their readers directly to judge whether our work stands or falls. It's allowed the indie writers to stand on their own 2 feet and not just rely on literary consultants or agents or trad publishers to assess their work. Indie publishing is a talent pool, so prospective trad publishers or agents can turn to bloggers and their reviews on Amazon or Goodreads to see how well a book is likely to sell if they take it on.
So you are really active on Twitter. How have you found that using social media has helped you as an author and to promote your books?
I love Twitter, and I've been overwhelmed by the wonderful reception my books and I have had on there. Again, it allows you to reach your readers directly, or in my case, the mums and dads and grandmas and grandpas and teachers and librarians who buy books for children. You can talk to them, get their views, get their reviews, and have some marvellous conversations too. Announcements can be instantaneous and appear via my Twitter feed at robkeeley.co.uk straight away. And it's told me about all sorts of writing opportunities, including some of the awards my books have won or been listed for. Plus, I can make up for the physical restrictions of a disability by going places virtually. I worked remotely with a school in Brighton as well as with book bloggers, and at robkeeley.co.uk you can see and read some of their reviews of my work. I do enjoy meeting and communicating with my readers, whether it's young people in school or library workshops or adult readers via the internet. You can find out what they enjoy reading, and it allows you to feed that back into your own work.
Rob raises an important point at the end of his interview there about how he enjoys getting out and meeting his own readers. Certainly from a marketing point of view, the most successful self-published children's authors are those who go out and do school visits and engage with their audience rather than sort of waiting for their audience to come to them.
And Rob also spoke there about how he enjoyed working with an illustrator. And because we thought that this was such an important part of publishing a children's book, our operations director Jane caught up with top illustrator Dave Hill to discover how an illustrator can bring an author's words to life. She started by asking him how he became an illustrator for children's books.
I've always been an artist. I've always been a working artist. I started out in comic books, doing science fiction stuff, working with 2000 AD in the Judge Dredd magazine. And then after that, I worked as a concept artist for video games. So I used to design characters and environments and storyboards. Illustration's always been a part of whatever it is I do. My passion was always book illustration, though. It got to a stage where I would go freelancing and see how it worked. And ever since getting the website, it went live, and within 2 weeks I had my first book. I haven't looked back since.
Which publishers do you work with?
I work with Concordia Publishing America, Paraclete Publishing. I work with Macmillan. They're really the big publishers. I do a lot of independent stuff. That's a big part of my job now.
What's your style of illustration?
My favourite style is pen and ink with watercolour. I still sketch on paper, but everything's inked on the computer now and coloured. because you can achieve, what looks like traditional media and digital programs. That's my favourite style. But I also enjoy working in a more graphic style, comic books. I still love that medium.
So how does it work? You get approached by, say, a self-publishing author or a publisher. How does the process work from there?
If it was the self-publishing author, I ask basically for a detailed brief and then follow that. And there's a lot of conversation during the process. So it starts off with sketches, pencil sketches, and everything's done, of course, by email. So it's a lot faster, you get an instant response. So sketches are emailed, the client approves them, and then I take it to the next stage, which is inking, and then the client approves that, and then the final stage is colour. So that's the process generally for everything. I mean, it's whether it's an independent publisher or mainstream or any illustration job, that is the procedure I go through. It's one where you keep in touch with your client and keep the client involved. It means that at the end result, the client knows exactly what they're getting because they've saw the sketch, they've saw the inked version. The only shock that they could possibly have is the colours. But generally, I don't have that much rework to do when it comes to the final art. There's certainly work to be done at the sketch stage, getting things the way people want it.
I guess the better the brief, the easier your job is.
Absolutely. So it's good to get everything done without any reworking at all. You've worked out a price based on production time. That price is always in the back of your mind. So if somebody says to you, that's not what I wanted that tree over there, and I want a lot of changes like that, is time consuming, and you end up working at a loss.
And I guess a lot of authors don't understand the process, so they think moving that tree is very simple, but actually it's quite time consuming.
It is very time consuming. So that's why I prefer to do my sketches tightly so that people can see what's going on. Although they're still rough sketches, I try and make it obvious that that's the tree there, that's the castle there.
Do you like to see the manuscript as well, or just a brief?
Just a brief. There's times when I ask for a manuscript. If the author, for example, if they want to focus on a particular scene, I try and discourage them to do that because I think it's always better to be a bit abstract on your cover. But rather than get embroiled in fine detail that's in the manuscript, it's easier just to keep things simple for the cover. But if they're insistent on fine detail, then I'll say, well, you're going to have to send me that part of the manuscript, so that I can find out everything that I need to know about that particular scene. But generally speaking, the brief should be enough.
Do you get sent authors' own sketches of how they picture things?
Yes, sometimes I do. And it can be a great help because it lets you see the way they're thinking. And there's nothing wrong with putting ideas down on paper, even if you can't draw. They have specific ideas, then I would ask for that anyway.
You talked about you set a fee when you do their work. Do you always do it on a flat fee, or do you do on royalty as well?
Always a flat fee. I find that it's the simplest way. Everything's down to production time. So if your book involves 12 illustrations that are really, really busy and each panel's got 100 horses in it, that's very time consuming.
How long would that take?
Oh my goodness. I would say maybe a week per page with something as busy as that. But if it was a single character, then obviously it's only going to take maybe half a day. You calculate it on production time. It's not like I'm wasting paint or anything like that. I have to buy the most expensive sable brushes. I used to, but not now. The only expense is time. So the flat fee is the easiest option for me, and I don't have to worry about getting an advance and then looking to profit from book sales.
It's been lovely to talk to you today. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot, Jane.
It's really interesting what Dave said there about how his fees reflect the amount of time it takes for him to complete his illustrations. I think that's definitely something potential children's authors really, really need to consider carefully. If you want a professional to illustrate your picture book, then you really need to be able to, you really need to be prepared to pay.
Exactly, and I think something else to consider is publishing children's picture books in ebook format, because picture books translate into ebook format very differently, affecting things like the positioning and display of images. So that's also something to bear in mind. There's definitely a lot of things to consider with creating a children's book. So to help with this, we spoke to Lauren, our Group Customer Services Manager at Matador, who gave us some handy hints when it came to publishing your children's book.
When it comes to book sizes and paper types, there are lots of options for children's books. I often ask children's book authors if they have a preferred book size in mind or a particular children's book that they like the style of. This can help me to decide what book size and paper type to quote for. For children's novels, which are text only or perhaps include only a few black and white line drawings, I would recommend a small standard book size called B format, which is 198 by 129mm. This type of book can also be printed on cost-effective book wove paper, which is a lovely quality and comes in either cream or white. When it comes to children's picture books, there are a few more points to take into consideration. Children's picture books tend to be quite short, so it is worth noting that most printers can only perfect bind a minimum of 32 pages. So perfect binding is when the spine is glued rather than stapled, and it is considered to be more professional and desirable by retailers. With this in mind, when you are writing your text and deciding how many illustrations to include in the book, my advice is to keep that magic number of 32 pages in mind. Having a minimum of 32 pages will give you more options for book sizes, including landscape dimensions and paper types. If your book is less than 32 pages, then there are still some great printing options available if you want to keep a perfect bound spine, so that's glued, not stapled. Landscape dimensions won't be available for less than 32 pages, so keep this in mind when creating your illustrations, but lots of portrait and square sizes will be available. Paperback is definitely the cheaper printing option, but hardback can prove more hard wearing for those little sticky fingers. My advice is to have costs for both options and then see which suits your budget.
And now some news from the publishing world.
Climate change is firmly on the agenda at the moment. The Booksellers Association have acknowledged that efforts for recycling are making great strides, but the publishers have been encouraged to think about how many books they're printing in the first place and how their distribution methods can be streamlined to have less of an impact on the environment. At Matador, we spend quite a lot of time looking at this area.
Although you may not want to think about it yet, Christmas is not that far away, and we're already getting into the busiest time of year for publishers. The big new releases are already out, and Super Thursday, the date where big publishers release their headline titles, has already come and gone. This year, Super Thursday fell on the 3rd and 17th of October, so bookshops have already had the big rush getting new books onto shelves ready for sale. Realistically, unless you're looking at self-publishing and ebook only, books still at the manuscript stage will now not be ready for Christmas. So if you're looking at trying for the Christmas market, a printed book is not going to be possible.
September saw the release of a highly anticipated sequel, The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, but it didn't go without controversy. As I'm sure you've all heard, Amazon accidentally sent out some copies which had been pre-ordered before the publication date due to what it called a technical glitch. This certainly angered bookshops who were under strict instructions not to break the embargo. There was also the mistake one bookshop made of misstickering the book with a Winner of the Booker Prize sticker, rather than the sticker which said shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Or maybe this was a hint.
It could have been. 2019 has also been the year for debate in children's books, with questions being asked about whether the publishing industry is doing enough. Our sales and marketing manager, Jonathan, has just attended the Independent Publishers Guild conference in London, where this topic was discussed.
I went recently to the IPG conference, which is the meeting of various independent publishers, and there was a fascinating talk there done by the Book Trust on diversity in the children's publishing industry. This is very much a hot topic at the moment because they've realised just how little diversity there is in this part of the industry, but there is also a big problem with diversity right the way across publishing. The Books Trust, which is a charity that works with books and to propagate books, actually commissioned a study with UCL to look at every children's book that was published in the UK between the dates of 2007 and 2017. And they came up with a rather startling conclusion by checking the authors and illustrators of these books, that only just over 8% of authors and illustrators of children's books during this time were of colour, and that they were responsible for only 5% of children's books which were published during this period. What was even worse was that when they were looking just at 2017, right at the end of the period, they realised that actually the figures had dropped and only 6% of authors and illustrators were of colour during that year. and the number of books they produced had and were responsible for had decreased to only 4%. So this is a big issue for the publishing industry and for children's books in particular, because obviously one wants as wide a range of authors and illustrators working in the field of children's books to give the maximum diversity that one can get in the actual books that are coming out. So the Books Trust, realising this was becoming a particular issue, and to address this are looking at the various ways that they can try and attract more authors and illustrators of colour to be putting their work forward for publishing, to be included in the publishing industry. They've got various ways in place to try and do this, to mentor authors and illustrators who are just entering the book industry with more established ones, to go out into schools and look at trying to get authors and illustrators out into schools to show that they are addressing this and to try and attract more authors and illustrators of colour into the industry. There's all sorts of initiatives that will be coming out. Authors and illustrators of colour should be aware of this, and that there are ways being put into place to try and address this issue and make it better.
At the end of the day, it's all about getting kids reading, and any way that this can be done can only be a good thing. Figures from the Progress in International Reading Literacy study show that of children who have less than 10 books in their house, 42% say that they don't like reading, and only 32% say they're very confident at reading. Children who engage with books at a young age are far more likely to carry that love with them as they grow up. Self-publishing is actually bucking the trend in diversity as well, by allowing authors from all sorts of backgrounds to become published authors. The latest blog on the Troubador publishing website, Self-Publishing and Diversity, highlights the experiences from 4 of our authors.
That's so true, because books that you have a connection with when you're younger really stick with you as you get older. I remember my mum reading me the first Harry Potter book when I was younger, and I've lost count of the number of times I've reread it since, and that was really the story that started my love of reading.
At the moment, I'm actually rereading The Lord of the Rings, which my dad first read to me back in the late 1970s. I just find that reading to children from a young age is so important if you want them to have a lifelong, love or engagement with books.
Absolutely. But where do you start when sitting down to write a children's book? Where do you get your ideas from? Andrea caught up with Angela Fish, author of the Ben and the Spider series for children aged 5 to 9, and The Captain's Favourite Treasure for little ones. Andrea started by asking how she came up with her ideas for her kids' books.
Talking about your first 3 stories which were published with the Book Guild, where did you get your ideas from for that?
The first one, Ben and the Spider Gate, it came about through a challenge. I belonged to a writer's circle, and we would experiment. We all had our own particular genre that we liked, but then we'd experiment with different things. So somebody said, shall we try writing for children? And we groaned and said, okay. And we always had a prompt, some kind of stimulus. So for this adventure, we chose story cubes.
Right.
And they're exactly like dice, but they have pictures, not dots. And the idea is that you roll as many as you wish, and you assign them a characteristic. So it could be that you're going to have a character, or it could be the plot, it could be the problem, whatever you choose. And really that's where it started.
That's really interesting, that is. I've never seen these before, this series of 9 dice really that you've got. If you're really struggling for ideas, that's a really good way of kind of getting an initial thought and then running with that.
Absolutely, and of course if you're stuck midway, you can do it again.
Was it always your intention to do 3?
No. Our challenge was to write 500 words. So I wrote 5,000. And then somebody said, well, you've got to finish it. When I was coming near the end, I knew I wanted to say more. I wanted the adventure to be bigger. But when I checked publishers' recommendations for the age group, it was around 10,000 words. Yeah. So what I did was stop the story with the one challenge.
Your 4th book, which is aimed at younger children, the pitch book Captain's Favourite Treasure, was through Matador.
Yes.
Self-publishing.
Yes. From the beginning, even before the first book was published, I'd been working with schools. Right. And one school in particular actually worked on the manuscripts with me all the way through. So that's been really helpful. But I also used to do quite a number of other schools and was asked to work with younger children. Through my writing group again, we'd done lots of challenges, and one of them was a picture book. So the Captain's Favourite Treasure was actually designed and written a long time before the Ben books. And it was in my cupboard. But when I used to go into schools and work with littlies, sometimes the Ben books were a little bit too, stretching them too far. I'd show it them, but to read to them, I'd read them the pirate story. And I'd done some illustrations using clip art. And a couple of the schools that I went into, the teachers were asking me, well, where can we get a copy? And I thought, well, I'm missing a trick here. Yeah. So I thought, well, I'm just going to do it myself. And I do a lot of book fairs. And I just thought it'd be nice to have something else on the table, something a little different. I just thought, well, I'm going to do this because I can do it. I knew it didn't need much editing. No. I found an illustrator that I was happy to work with. And I just thought, well, I'm just going to go with this, and it was done fairly quickly.
Do you find that you kind of almost need the illustrations to tell your story with the younger ones?
With the picture books, it's essential, I'd say. And something I learned, so many years ago, was that when you're writing the story, obviously as a writer, you're describing things. When you're working with an illustrator, you don't need all that. You have to let the pictures tell a lot of the story. So sometimes you have to change the words afterwards because the picture is so self-explanatory. You don't need to say that somebody was a red and green parrot, which is one of the characters, because it's there, because you can see it. And a lot of the teachers that I've had feedback from, especially on the picture book, have said how much the children have enjoyed looking at the pictures, talking about them, and that they're going to use that as a springboard for work in school. Which other islands could this little boy go to, and what would they be called? Because the illustrator made the island look like its name. So we've got Witch's Island, and it looks like a witch's hat. And Jigsaw Island, which is a tree with all jigsaws and little jigsaw people running around.
It's telling, isn't it, now how Angela, just as Rob Keeley earlier, likes to get out and about to meet her readers. It just helps create that connection with the kids and engages their imagination. Talking of Rob Keeley, we interviewed him earlier, but as his kids' book Childish Spirits has been made into an audiobook recently, we thought it would be nice to hear how narrator Sally Molest had brought this book to life.
Ellie blinked. The clock had stopped. It was midnight. Ellie froze. She could hear a faint melody. The whistling had started again. And this time it was here, in their flat. Ellie stood listening. The sound was moving across the room. The main door slammed shut. Charlie shifted uncomfortably. After a moment, Ellie breathed. She stood, wondering what to do. Go back to bed? That made sense. The flat was cold, and bed, if not warm, had at least been warmer. The house was dark, and she would be alone. But outside, a short walk away, lay the nursery, and the answer to who was whistling that tune. Ellie grabbed her fleece from a nearby chair. She put it on over her night things, zipped it right up to her neck. She grabbed Charlie's torch from the floor by the sofa bed, then she headed for the door. With only the torch to light her way, Ellie emerged into the hall. She shivered slightly as she heard whistling. Just a few notes. She jumped. She heard another door slam. She used the torch to find it. Nearby, a narrow wooden door was blowing in the cold night air. Beyond it was a flight of steep stone steps leading downward. A cellar, she supposed. She pulled the door shut. There was silence. Then Ellie heard another sound. Footsteps on the staircase to the first floor. She grasped the banister rail and crept upstairs. She reached the upper corridor just in time to hear the slamming of another door. Somehow she knew which door that would be.
And that's all we have time for in this podcast. We look forward to catching you in our next episode, where we'll be talking all things books and crime.
You've been listening to the Self-Publishing Experience. Learn more about indie and self-publishing at our website, troubador.co.uk.